It's been, I mean, what a fascinating day. I mean, and what a great selection of speakers as well. I mean, I think the range of views and I think the diversity of views is the most important thing here. There was particularly in that last panel, you couldn't say there was a lot of strict agreement on many issues, which I think always makes for the absolute best discussion.
No, the last panel was particularly lively. Strict lack of agreement on issues.
Fantastic.
Down to Bilahari substantially, but he always does a very good job of that. So now
next year, let's get him for every panel and just put him on.
That's right. Yeah, he'd probably go for that. I think possibly. Now, Ben, there's a bit of a tradition here of me putting a hard word on the Bloomberg compere, your colleague Ed, in the past to very quickly do what you have to do at Bloomberg all the time and come up with some news stories from 2 days of talks or even today's talks. And what do you think the potential stories might be?
Well, I could cheat because I actually wrote one of the stories about yesterday's session. But I think the really interesting thing about the last session we just had, the CISWO session, was I thought the ambassador's comments sort of about how you can have a broad partnership across the region, how Indonesia doesn't necessarily see itself as wanting to be pulled into this geostrategic competition between the US and China. I mean, I think that is interesting, not just for Indonesia as a major and very important partner of Australia, but also for how that might be the perspective of all these other very important Southeast Asian countries who now find themselves slap bang in the middle of that contest between the US and China. And I think that would be something I would definitely be focusing on if I was running downstairs. Actually, the other problem about this is that my colleagues are probably writing up the previous sessions now, and so I don't want to say what I think the angle should be, and then they write something different. And so division, all I'll say is, whatever we did, I'm sure it was fantastic.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. Well, I've got more time than you. I briefing monthly, we don't have a firm deadline, so it's sometime next week, I suppose. So, I couldn't help frame what I thought about the last couple of days when I was looking out the window before, thinking it's 3 years since we were here at Bloomberg for this. So I was just trying to think about how about what we've been talking about in the last 2 days that we wouldn't have been talking about 3 years ago, in 2019. And I sort of got three sort of broad concepts there that sort of attempt to sum up what we've been through the last 2 days. The first one is just the whole concept of supply chains. Now, it's not very new to observe that it's a common observation we make about this in conferences these days, that we didn't talk about supply chains very much. People didn't even know what supply chains were in some cases 3 years ago. So that's been an obvious theme of the last couple of days, from the really prosaic sort of Australian local take on it, which was Elizabeth Bowes talking about how Australian companies were so shocked by the Chinese trade bans of a couple of years ago, but that now they're adjusting to it, and they're adjusting to the idea of being able to cope with diverse supply chains, while at the same time acknowledging that China remains a very big trading partner. In fact, imports from China were higher last year than ever before. So, but then the whole supply chain debate, it struck me, has a much higher level quality to it. And I was particularly struck by Evan Fegelbaum's explanation yesterday, which I hadn't thought about how he suggested that the breakdown in the happy relationship between the US and China, where business could go ahead and have a good time and prosper in China while there were still security concerns, really started when technology became a big part of supply chains. And he was sort of, I think, suggesting that was a couple of decades ago, really. And that once that happened, business had to sort of engage more with government and think more about security issues. And from that point on, we've sort of, by his putting his framing, that really has taken us to where we are now. So it really transcended Xi Jinping coming to office, for example. So I thought that was a really interesting take on the changing nature of supply chains, because technology is such a big part of them. As Michaela Browning suggested yesterday, trade is shifting, becoming digital. So and security and cybersecurity and things like that are far more important. The other interesting concept that I think has been kicked around quite a bit over the last 2 days is the how we should see the relationship between China and Russia. We would have still been talking about the Party Congress here, regardless of what had happened in the last 3 years, for example. But there's been a big emphasis on China and Russia, and is it, as I think Evan said yesterday, a sort of diminishing asset for China? And what does a China bloc look like if Russia's a diminishing asset? It's a sort of interesting idea. So I think that's a theme for a lot of these discussions. And I think it was particularly interesting, the conversation between Raja and Evan yesterday about the Central Asian republics and how they've sort of escaped Soviet domination. They want to avoid Chinese domination. And so what goes on there is a bit of an insight into how a new world might really look. So I think, and then I'm really struck, one of the takeaways I've really taken from this gathering is Raja's constant return to the idea that we should, just through all of this discussion, the negative and mostly negative discussion about China, that we need to think a little bit about who we're going to be dealing with after Xi and who we're going to be dealing with after Putin, because that will eventually happen. Sure, it might take a long time to happen and there might be a lot of pain and suffering before that does happen, but that's something we need to sort of bear in mind as a sort of governing framework for some of this discussion. Now, the third point I think has been flowing through the 2 days has been this whole conversation about the changing nature of cooperation, or perhaps the declining quality of cooperation that comes in two forms, I think. It's so, without recounting all of the discussions, we had Wendy, for example, talking about how friendshoring sounds like a solution to some of this declining cooperation at the geopolitical level in the G20 and so forth. But in practice, it's not so easy. And she had those illustrations of how that solution to declining geopolitical competition doesn't really work very well. Raja, for example, had his I think he's made this point a couple of times about the solution from his perspective seems to be a multiplicity of quads and AUKUSes and whatever's coming next as a solution to the decline of, say, the G20, say the IMF, that sort of thing. And then I think Richard Moore left us with a worrying sort of idea that the Kurt Campbell framing of competition without catastrophe doesn't seem to be working. So that's really a disturbing sort of idea, I think. But I want to leave everyone with a very prosaic sort of Australian take on this, because looking forward to next week's budget and the idea that, and this is picking up on, I think, Wendy's comment yesterday about the latest World Bank IMF meetings being more about blaming each other rather than finding a pathway forward. And I think a point has been made that Jim Chalmers, our Treasurer, who's about to present his first budget next week of a new Labor government, went off to Washington last week talking a bit tough about how he's going to tell the Fed to take it easy on interest rate rises, but nothing seems to have come of that, not surprisingly. I think what's been forgotten is his mentor and predecessor and Treasurer as first Treasurer in the last Labor government in its early years, Wayne Swan, also went off to Washington at about the same time in his treasurership and came back really worried about the state of the world before the global financial crisis. But I think Wayne Swan came back with the idea that the G20 Fire Brigade was coming down the road to help countries out and that China was still going to be a responsible stakeholder in the world. So I think Jim Chalmers came back last week and he's now preparing his budget as we talk. But I think when he gets up on Tuesday night, he's going to find he's much more lonely in the world than Wayne Swan was. And that's the sort of worrying thing for Australia, I think.
That's right. And also, I mean, I think the other major difference is that back during the last global financial crisis, China wasn't just a good global player, but it was in many ways, the flotation device that saved us during the difficult times of the GFC. This time, China is one of the main reasons that there is upcoming global financial, not global financial crisis, but economic issue around the world. So I think that's really interesting. I really like your points there, Gary. I think they're great. And I think on the China-Russia relationship, endlessly fascinating relationship, there was one quote from yesterday that I thought was just fascinating, where someone said, there is no limits friendship. And it goes back to that statement that the Chinese and Russian governments made, that everyone responded to very strongly, that they had a no limits friendship. But as someone pointed out, there is no limits friendship between any partner, no matter how close they might be. And I thought that was a really interesting touchstone to take going forward into the rest of this Ukraine crisis.
Yeah, I think we would have been talking about China here regardless of what happened, whether we were getting on well or not. But the Russian element's quite a fascinating sort of new component to it.
Oh, absolutely. Now we have some polls that we have put together over the course of this discussion, and we've got some fascinating results. Hopefully the other poll ended up not 50-50, but if it did, that's also very interesting. So the first one from yesterday, geopolitics, our region in flux. The question was, what is the biggest threat to global peace and security?
Yes, well, I was surprised to see that, and perhaps this says something about our sophisticated audience at this event, that they settled on food insecurity and energy costs as being about, it was 45 or so percent. I thought the bleeding obvious answer to that question probably was going to be the Russia-Ukraine war or the China-Taiwan tensions. But I think the fact that people really zeroed in on the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war in particular, but those sorts of tensions on people in other countries is really the fracture point in the world. And so I thought that was a really sophisticated answer to that question.
Maybe they've just all seen the price of a lettuce at the moment down at Woolworths.
Well, perhaps it was. Perhaps it boils down to that. Yeah, I guess you can't dismiss the hip pocket nerve, can you?
And we haven't got results from that from previous years. That's very much a this year question.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Okay, right. Well, so let's move to the second question, which is finding stability, which was which country in the region presents the biggest opportunity for Australian businesses? And so we have A, China, B, India, C, Indonesia, D, Japan, E, Korea, or F, Vietnam.
Yes, well, what we saw there is quite interesting because we've seen a bit of a rebound for China. China had been on a declining trajectory from being more than 50% when we started out 5 years ago. And China came in at 34%, and that compared with 14% last year when the really sudden dip in Australian relations with China became very evident and was evident in other opinion polls. So I was surprised by China's apparent recovery in that poll yesterday. India was down a bit and Indonesia was down a bit as a consequence of that. So they were the rising countries in the last couple of years as China declined. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that, apart from perhaps it reflects the new mood in Australia that our current government can somehow restore relations with China and that the business relationship might recover in some way. So I think, that was quite interesting. I expected China to continue to drop.
Isn't that fascinating? Because one thing that Pew Research, which constantly shows, is that Australia's feelings towards China are only turning more negative. It'll be interesting to see if when that poll is taken this year, if there shows a similar sort of turnaround back towards maybe more positive feelings for China under the new government. But I mean, if that is the case, that would be fascinating.
Yes.
Speaking of China, the third question we had today, which the audience voted on, was China's influence is rapidly growing in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific through aid, investment and military power. What should Australia do? A, push back, or B, more or less accept what is happening? And what was the results on that?
Well, contrary to the poll yesterday where China staged a remarkable recovery, we continued on what I call a gentle trajectory down for China, which was 51-49, 51% thought we should accept China's power and work with it, and 49% people in the poll thought we should push back. Now, that's a more benign result from China's perspective than, say, the Lowy poll has been showing, where it showed that very savage slump in trust towards China over the last 2 years. But our poll has shown just a gradual trajectory from, when we first did this poll, 90% of people said we should work with China. We're down to 51% now.
When was the first one taken?
That was 2018.
Wow.
So, and it quickly fell after that, I must say. That might have been an errant starting point, but it's been on, but as I say, it's been on a gentle sort of decline. So I think our audience seems more optimistic about China than the mainstream view out there in the opinion polls and certainly in the security agencies, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it almost feels like Sydney is a bunch of hawks and Melbourne were very dovish in comparison. And then the final question during that last session was, where should Australia prioritise its diplomatic resources to foster greater engagement across the region?
Yeah, well, I think the results we got to that poll, which we asked last year for the first time, were right immediately after AUKUS was announced. So it was quite new then as an option. Well, really, AUKUS has remained as we don't have the numbers up there, but AUKUS, really got very little support. The Quad declined surprisingly last year. The Quad had reasonably strong support. But I think the big change today, in today's poll, was the strong support for bilateral engagement as the principal focus of diplomacy, which was up to 59 or 60%, I think. Last year it was 20%, and last year the strongest support was for economic engagement via the trade deals, by RCEP, by the CPTPP and other trade initiatives like that. Well, there's a question there, yeah. So we've shifted from, I guess, economic determinism, seeing trade deals as the way ahead for engagement in the region, to broader bilateral diplomacy, I suppose, which I think that perhaps does reflect the moment in a way.
It does a bit, yeah. I think that's really very fascinating. I think the idea that we've sort of started to lose faith in those, or perhaps that we had far more faith in it last year than we do this year, is a really interesting finding from that particular survey. And you mentioned the Quad. What was the drop there that we saw?
Well, the Quad's dropped from 25% of people thought the Quad should be the principal way of the primary focus of diplomacy, and it's down to 6 this year.
Wow! So
that's at odds with all the emphasis on the Quad we've seen in the last couple of years, and the new initiatives, the public goods focus of the Quad, all these, and its expansion, its increasing contact with other countries like Korea and Vietnam and so forth. I think bilateral engagement, we seem to be backing our government's ability to make its way in the region by itself.
I think it's interesting because it almost feels like a big chunk of that Quad vote has gone straight into the bilateral engagement, which maybe suggests that people are a bit more interested in a more relaxed one-on-one focus than that sort of big unilateral showy deals like we had in the Quad.
Yeah, well, I think that's my reading of these figures as well.
Yeah, interesting. It gives us all something to discuss over lunch, which we're about to head off to. Is there anything else you want to talk about today?
No, I think we've probably talked enough.
Well, those findings are fantastic. And look, thank you for joining me up here on the stage. And just one more time, thank you for all our guests today. It's been a fantastic session.